Welcome back to Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing, where we explore how to close the gap between knowing and doing in laboratory work. I'm Jessica Martin, a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I build this podcast with and for the people who train and support those working in labs. Together, we examine how training, systems, and everyday practice come together to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing. Over the course of the first season of Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing, we covered a wide range of topics: training, safety, lab culture, chemical hazards, and the realities of work inside laboratory environments. But when I stepped back and looked across all of those conversations, two themes kept showing up again and again. The first is the importance of experiential learning, the need for hands-on, physically grounded approaches to training and safety. And the second is the critical role of systems and structures, specifically the systems that support and reward the behaviors we say we care about. Because if this season has shown us anything, it has shown us that it's not enough to tell people what to do. We have to prepare them to do it and build environments that make it possible. So in this episode, I want to revisit this first season through those two lenses. Working inside of wet labs is a hands-on craft. Keeping people safe in those labs is also a hands-on endeavor. And yet, over the last few decades, we've steadily moved away from that hands-on experience. Then we act surprised when people with wet lab degrees lack the skills or the confidence to do the work they were trained for. But it's not just the kids who aren't all right here. We see the impact all through the hierarchy. In episode 5, I challenged the assumption that completing a degree in a wet lab field equates to practical competence. Through personal experience, pandemic-era disruptions, and examples from teaching labs, I argued that systemic choices, often driven by limited funding and time constraints, strip away critical hands-on learning opportunities. When students are shielded from struggle, responsibility, and real-world tasks, they graduate with gaps in both skill and confidence. In trying to make learning more efficient or less frustrating, educators may unintentionally be teaching incompetence instead of cultivating capable, confident lab professionals. Then, when these students enter environments where skills are assumed based on degree and lab experience, they face frustrated bosses and colleagues when the skills gaps reveal themselves. The theme about the limitations around hands-on training follows us into graduate school and academic research labs, both in really basic ways and when it comes to more complex situations. In episode 2, I challenged the effectiveness of traditional eyewash training by highlighting a critical gap between knowing how an eyewash works and being prepared to use it in an emergency. This episode emphasized that most lab workers have never physically used an eyewash station and may overestimate how uncomfortable or difficult it is. I also explored the reality of incidents, where individuals may be in pain, disoriented, and effectively blind, arguing that training should better reflect these conditions. Through examples and reflections, I advocated for more hands-on experiential training approaches that build familiarity, confidence, and readiness, while also reinforcing shared responsibility and good lab practices. In episode 8, I pushed us to think more deeply about our working alone policies and the hands-on practice that should be occurring so that these policies are meaningful. Using the tragic case of Sherry Sanji at UCLA as a lens, this episode shifted the focus from post-incident criticism to a deeper question: are lab workers actually prepared to respond in emergencies? The episode argues that while lab safety training emphasizes hazard recognition and prevention, it often neglects realistic preparation for emergency response. Without hands-on scenario-based drills, even well-intentioned buddies may be unable to act effectively under pressure. The result is a gap between policy and practice, one that leaves researchers feeling unprepared and vulnerable. Ultimately, the episode called for a shift towards experiential, physically grounded training that builds both competence and confidence in emergency situations. So what happens when we apply this same thinking to the people responsible for training others? In episode 10, Leah Player led us into her world, in which she decided to bring experiential learning into an annual safety training for the folks in charge, in this case, educators and teaching labs. By switching from giving a training to running her team through a drill, everyone was able to learn how the system was not actually designed effectively. And then they were able to take actions to change the system so that it did support proper response. This episode examines how traditional refresher safety training often fails to change behavior and explores how replacing passive review with a simple hands-on drill can improve outcomes. Through a case study with a faculty training program, a low-cost chemical spill scenario revealed critical gaps between written procedures and real-world response. By bringing together frontline workers, safety professionals, and decision makers in a shared exercise, the training evolved into a powerful learning experience that led to immediate system improvements. We discussed this approach in connection with the concept of guided adaptability, discussed in a review by Provin, Woods, Decker, and Ray, emphasizing that effective safety programs must support people in adapting to real conditions, not just complying with static procedures. And this isn't just a question for educators, it applies to safety professionals as well. In episode 6, we looked at the impact of a hands-on approach among safety professionals. I used Ray and Provin's Safety of Work framework to consider Husing's paper that examined how different groups of safety professionals related to SCUT work in a case study at a major university. Rather than interpreting their differences as simply cultural or identity-based, e.g. relational versus compliance-oriented, the episode reframes the issue by asking, how does each group engage with the actual work required to make safety happen? Through this lens, attitudes towards SCUT work become revealing. One group distanced itself from hands-on operational tasks, reinforcing a separation between oversight and execution. The other engaged more directly with the messy, practical realities of lab work. Using Ray and Provin, the episode argues that this difference is not just about preference. It reflects fundamentally different relationships to the work of safety itself. Ultimately, the episode shows that safety is shaped by how willing individuals and systems are to engage with the real, often unglamorous work required to support safe practice. But experiential learning alone isn't enough. The systems in which people are working can either support these efforts or completely undermine them. In episode 3, I introduced the concept of safety climate through the work of Dov Zohar, focusing on how people interpret what actually matters in their organization. The episode emphasized that safety climate is about how workers interpret organizational priorities, consistency, and leadership behavior, particularly when safety competes with other demands like productivity. It highlighted key theoretical developments, including relative priorities, espousal enactment gaps, and internal consistency, and connected these ideas to real-world lab experiences, illustrating how individuals learn which rules truly matter. Ultimately, the episode framed safety climate as a sense-making process that shapes expectations about which behaviors will be supported and rewarded. And we saw how those same dynamics play out in practice in episode 11, Mapping Power, Pressure, and Protection. Monica Hensley and I examined laboratory safety through the eyes of graduate student researchers. Drawing on personal stories and shared experiences, we considered 3 core challenges: policies that don't align with reality, legacy lab messes, and ongoing battles over money and authority. We observed that safety breakdowns are not primarily about individual behavior, but about fragmented systems that shape and constrain decision-making at the bench. Through the lens of peer-led workshops and laboratory safety teams, the episode highlighted how graduate student researchers can become change agents, building community, identifying systems gaps, and working collectively to improve both safety and research productivity. We brought this same question, what gets rewarded and supported, into lone work policies with Myla Kara in episode 7. This episode examined the reality of working alone in academic wet labs, challenging the effectiveness of blanket no lone work policies. Through storytelling, personal experience, and real-world incidents, the discussion highlighted how academic structures, graduate student schedules, limited resources, and cultural expectations of independence drive researchers to work alone despite safety guidance. the conversation called for more nuanced approaches, including identifying high-risk tasks that must never be done alone, implementing realistic check-in systems, and equipping all lab members, and if possible, all building inhabitants, to respond effectively in emergencies. And these questions become even more important when we look at exposure risks, especially those that don't produce immediate signals. Episode 12, The Chemical Sensitizer's Wake-Up Call, was an in-depth discussion with Myla Kara examining peptide coupling agents through a combination of case studies, toxicological evidence, and regulatory analysis. The discussion revealed critical gaps in current safety systems, including inconsistent safety data sheets, limitations of exposure limits, and the reactive nature of respiratory protection programs. It emphasized that effective prevention requires a shift toward containment, early symptom recognition, and system-level thinking, supported by stronger data, better communication, and proactive lab practices. In episode 13, we explored how some of the most serious laboratory hazards often go unrecognized until significant harm has already occurred. We used the story of Marie Curie to examine both the pride of the overworked researcher as well as systematic lack of institutional support as root causes for the radiation exposure she and her colleagues suffered. Kate McNally then joined us to describe her modern case of peptide coupling agent sensitization, a discussion that revealed how early warning signals are frequently dismissed, misunderstood, or normalized within lab culture. It argues that gaps in communication and institutional support can allow these risks to persist, and that improving safety requires not just better rules, but better awareness, shared experiences, and pattern recognition across the scientific community. So when we look across this first season, these two themes, experiential learning and system design, aren't separate. They're deeply connected. Experiential learning helps people build the ability to act, and systems determine whether they can act. And that brings us back to one of the core ideas that has shown up throughout this podcast, the gap between knowing and doing. Experiential learning helps close that gap by preparing people for real conditions. But if the systems around them don't support the right behaviors, if the signals, incentives, and structures aren't aligned, that gap opens right back up. So if we want to develop lab workers who are truly skilled, safe, and trailblazing, we can't just focus on training, and we can't just focus on rules. We have to focus on how people learn to do the work, and whether the environments they work in actually support them in doing it well. Because this isn't just about safety, it's about how we support people in doing excellent work. Work that is reliable, effective, and capable of pushing science forward. And that's where we're going next. In Season 2, we're going to go deeper into that connection, how training, systems, and culture come together to shape what actually happens in the lab. Not just what lab workers should know, but what enables them to act. And how we build environments that support both safe work and trailblazing science. I also want to thank all of those folks who have reached out to me to share their challenges and co-create content for our community. In Season 1, you got to hear from Myla Kara, Becca Powers, Leah Kozovsky, Amanda Pitt, Penny Antoniou, Dan Scungio, Jason Nagy, Leah Player, Monica Hensley, and Kate McNally. Season 2 is going to be bringing you more voices from our community with whom I am so deeply honored to share a platform. Let's keep working together to close the gap between knowing and doing in laboratory work. Thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.